In this episode, we are focusing on a part of auditing that can sound dry at first, but actually determines whether audit work deserves to be trusted at all. When people first begin studying for the Certified Information Systems Auditor (CISA) certification, they often pay close attention to controls, risks, systems, and findings, but they do not always notice the framework that makes those activities professional rather than informal. That framework is built from standards, guidelines, and codes of ethics, and together they shape how an auditor plans work, gathers evidence, exercises judgment, and behaves when pressure appears. For a beginner, this topic matters because auditing is not simply a matter of being smart enough to notice problems. It is also a matter of doing the work in a way that is consistent, fair, credible, and worthy of confidence. Without that foundation, two auditors could look at the same process, do very different work, act from very different motives, and still claim they performed an audit. Standards, guidelines, and ethics exist, so the profession does not drift into that kind of confusion. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A standard is best understood as an established expectation for how audit work should be performed and what quality that work must meet. It gives structure to the profession by setting a baseline for matters such as planning, evidence, documentation, reporting, independence, and professional care. This is important because an audit is not just a private opinion formed in someone's head after a few conversations and a quick look at a system. It is supposed to be a disciplined engagement that can be explained, reviewed, and relied upon by others. Standards help make that possible by creating a common professional foundation. When an auditor says that a process was evaluated or that a finding is supported, the audience should be able to assume that the work followed recognized expectations rather than personal habit alone. For beginners, the easiest way to think about standards is to see them as the rules that keep audit work from becoming random. They do not answer every question in detail, but they establish what responsible audit performance must look like at a professional level. This matters because trust in auditing depends on consistency as much as insight. Imagine two organizations being told that their access controls were reviewed, but one review involved careful planning, clear criteria, strong evidence, and documented reasoning, while the other relied mostly on casual conversation and unchecked assumptions. Both might use the word audit, yet only one would deserve the confidence that the word is supposed to carry. Standards help protect the meaning of the work by narrowing the range of what counts as acceptable professional practice. They do not make every audit identical, since no two environments are exactly the same, but they do help ensure that important qualities remain present across engagements. A learner should see this as one of the most practical reasons standards exist. They support comparability, repeatability, and credibility. Management, boards, regulators, and other stakeholders need to believe that audit results come from disciplined methods rather than from mood, personality, or convenience. Standards are one of the main reasons that confidence is possible. Standards also matter because they shape the entire life cycle of an audit engagement, not just the final report. They influence how an auditor determines scope, how risk is considered, how evidence is evaluated, how much documentation is necessary, and how conclusions should be communicated. In other words, they are present from the earliest planning decisions all the way to follow-up after findings have been issued. This gives the audit process an internal logic that beginners can learn to recognize. The auditor is not improvising each step from scratch. The work is being carried out within a professional structure that expects care, relevance, supportable conclusions, and responsible communication. That helps prevent some common failures. Without standards, an auditor might collect too little evidence, confuse suspicion with proof, or write vague findings that sound important but lack support. Standards push the work toward a higher level of discipline. They remind the auditor that every conclusion should be connected to objective criteria, relevant evidence, and a clear understanding of why the issue matters to the organization. Guidelines are different from standards, and beginners benefit from understanding that difference clearly rather than treating the two terms as interchangeable. If standards establish what must characterize sound audit work, guidelines help explain good ways to apply those expectations in practice. They offer direction, interpretation, and practical advice for handling common situations, but they are usually more flexible than standards because real environments vary and professional judgment still matters. A guideline might help an auditor think through how to approach evidence collection, how to interpret risk in a given context, or how to structure certain parts of an engagement when the standard itself does not prescribe every detail. This does not make guidelines unimportant. In fact, they are often extremely useful because they help translate professional expectations into day-to-day practice. The simplest way to understand the relationship is this: standards define the professional floor, while guidelines help the auditor move across that floor with greater confidence and consistency. They support application, not by replacing judgment, but by informing it. That practical support becomes especially valuable because information systems auditing rarely happens in neat, identical environments. One audit may involve a mature organization with well-documented processes and strong management oversight, while another may involve a smaller or less formal environment where controls exist but are unevenly documented. The standard still matters in both cases, but the path to satisfying the standard may not look identical in each setting. Guidelines help the auditor think through those differences without losing professional quality. They can encourage careful questioning, better planning decisions, or stronger evaluation of what evidence is persuasive in a given scenario. They also help newer auditors build judgment by showing how experienced professionals tend to reason through common issues. This is important because beginners sometimes assume that anything less than a rigid formula is weakness. In reality, auditing needs both structure and judgment. Guidelines support the judgment side by helping auditors apply professional expectations thoughtfully instead of mechanically, especially when the environment is messy or the answer is not obvious at first glance. A code of ethics adds another layer to this framework by addressing not just how audit work should be performed, but how the auditor should conduct themselves as a professional human being while performing it. This is crucial because a technically strong process can still lose value if the person carrying it out is careless, biased, dishonest, reckless with confidential information, or willing to bend their conclusions to please powerful stakeholders. A code of ethics exists to protect the integrity of the profession by establishing expectations about character, conduct, and professional responsibility. It reinforces the idea that auditing is not only a technical activity, but also a trust-based role. The auditor often sees sensitive information, evaluates important controls, and communicates issues that may affect careers, budgets, and leadership decisions. That kind of access and influence requires more than intelligence. It requires integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and a commitment to competence. When beginners hear the phrase code of ethics, they should not think of it as a formal speech attached to the profession. They should think of it as a practical safeguard for trust. Ethics matter because audit work often places people in situations where the easier path is not the right path. An auditor may discover a weakness that reflects poorly on an influential manager. They may be asked to soften language so a report sounds less troubling than the evidence supports. They may encounter confidential information that is interesting, sensitive, or politically valuable. They may even be tempted to work beyond the edge of their competence rather than admit they need help or deeper understanding. In all of those situations, ethical expectations provide direction that technical rules alone cannot fully supply. Objectivity means the auditor should not let personal relationships, fear, pride, or pressure distort the work. Confidentiality means information obtained during the engagement should be handled responsibly and not treated like casual conversation material. Competence means the auditor should perform work with due care and recognize when a matter exceeds their current knowledge. Ethics are therefore not abstract ideals floating above the job. They guide real choices in real moments when the quality and credibility of the audit are most vulnerable. When you put these three ideas side by side, a very useful distinction begins to appear. Standards tell the auditor what professional quality audit work must include. Guidelines help the auditor apply those expectations in a more practical and thoughtful way. Codes of ethics govern the conduct and character that make the work trustworthy in the first place. Together, they form a kind of professional framework around the entire engagement. If one part is missing, the work becomes weaker in a different way. An auditor who follows standards but ignores ethics may produce technically neat work that cannot be trusted morally. An auditor who has strong ethical intentions but ignores standards may be sincere yet still perform weak and inconsistent work. An auditor who ignores guidelines may meet the minimum more often than not, but may miss opportunities to apply judgment well or navigate complexity effectively. For a beginner, this is one of the most important connections to understand. These are not competing ideas. They support one another, and together they shape what professional audit behavior looks like from both a technical and human perspective. A simple example can make the relationship easier to remember. Imagine an auditor reviewing user access to a sensitive business application. Standards would shape the engagement by requiring proper planning, sufficient evidence, appropriate documentation, and supportable conclusions. Guidelines might help the auditor think through useful ways to inspect access approval records, compare active users to job responsibilities, evaluate periodic access reviews, and decide what kinds of exceptions deserve deeper attention. Ethics would matter if the auditor discovered that a senior manager's access was inappropriate or if the auditor was tempted to ignore a gap because it seemed politically inconvenient to raise. In that one scenario, all three elements are active at the same time. The standards protect the quality of the work, the guidelines help the work be performed more effectively, and the ethics protect the honesty and fairness of the auditor. This is why the topic matters so much. These are not side notes to the real job. They are part of what makes the real job professional. Another example appears in reporting. Suppose an auditor has gathered evidence that change management approvals are inconsistent and that production changes sometimes occur without proper review. Standards help ensure the finding is supported, clearly described, and tied to relevant criteria rather than vague concern. Guidelines may help the auditor think through how to present the issue in a balanced way, how to explain the related risk, and how to distinguish between isolated exceptions and a broader control weakness. Ethics then become critical if management pushes back and asks for softer language that would make the report less accurate than the evidence justifies. The ethical response is not to become dramatic or hostile. It is to remain fair, objective, and truthful while communicating the issue responsibly. This kind of situation shows why many beginners underestimate the role of ethics at first. They imagine ethics only as extreme misconduct, when in reality ethical pressure often appears in quieter forms such as selective language, incomplete disclosure, or subtle pressure to preserve comfort over accuracy. Beginners also benefit from understanding several misconceptions about this topic, because these misunderstandings can make the domain feel more confusing than it needs to be. One common misconception is that standards are little more than formal paperwork that matters only to large organizations or external reviewers. In truth, standards matter wherever audit conclusions need to be credible, because credibility depends on disciplined process no matter the size of the environment. Another misconception is that guidelines are optional in the sense of being unimportant. They may be more flexible than standards, but flexibility is not the same as irrelevance. A third misconception is that ethics mainly concerns obvious wrongdoing such as fraud or lying. Those things matter, of course, but ethics also governs quieter professional choices such as resisting bias, protecting confidentiality, avoiding conflicts of interest, and being honest about the limits of your own competence. When these misconceptions are corrected, the topic becomes more practical. Standards, guidelines, and ethics are not ceremonial features of the profession. They are working tools that shape real decisions. The consequences of ignoring this framework can be serious for both the organization and the profession. Weak standards application can lead to incomplete planning, poor evidence, unsupported findings, inconsistent reporting, and bad decisions by leadership. Weak use of guidelines can leave auditors unprepared for complexity, causing them to overlook context, misjudge risk, or apply rigid thinking where thoughtful judgment was needed. Ethical failure can be even more damaging because once trust in the auditor is compromised, even technically strong work may be questioned. If stakeholders believe the auditor is biased, careless with confidential information, or willing to bend under pressure, the value of the audit function drops quickly. This matters far beyond one report. Audit work exists to help organizations see reality more clearly. If the work is unreliable, leadership may underestimate risk, delay needed action, or make decisions based on a false sense of security. Over time, that kind of failure damages confidence not only in one engagement, but in the broader profession's promise of objective and supportable assurance. For someone preparing for the exam, one of the best ways to think about this domain is to treat standards, guidelines, and ethics as clues to what the best answer is often trying to protect. Many exam questions in this area are not really asking whether you memorized a phrase. They are asking whether you understand what responsible audit behavior looks like when evidence is incomplete, pressure is present, scope is unclear, or a conflict of interest may exist. That means the strongest answer is often the one that preserves quality, objectivity, sufficient support, and professional integrity. If a choice sounds convenient but weakens independence, it is probably not the best choice. If a choice rushes to conclusion without adequate evidence, it is probably not the best choice. If a choice protects comfort at the expense of honest reporting, it is almost certainly not the best choice. When beginners study this topic through that lens, the concepts become easier to apply. They stop feeling like abstract obligations and start feeling like the logic behind trustworthy audit work. As we close, the most important thing to carry forward is that standards, guidelines, and codes of ethics are not decorative pieces around the edges of auditing. They are the framework that gives the profession its shape, its reliability, and its moral center. Standards create the baseline for professional quality work. Guidelines help auditors apply that work intelligently in real environments, and ethics protects the character and conduct that make the work worthy of trust. Together, they help ensure that an audit is more than a personal opinion or a procedural exercise. They make it a disciplined, credible, and principled form of assurance that organizations can use to understand their systems more honestly. For a beginner, that is the real heart of the topic. You are not just learning rules to remember for an exam. You are learning why the profession expects audit work to be done carefully, applied thoughtfully, and carried out by people whose judgment can be trusted when the stakes are real and the pressure to compromise is often very human.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.